All right, do you have it?
I believe I did it like a blink, so maybe. Oh yeah, Youri is recording. Yep, I got it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, everybody, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Super happy, super honored with the guest we have now. We are joined by Ms.Adley. Mnar is the founder and editor in chief of Mintpress News, which is a brilliant anti-imperialist website. And all right, let's let's get to it. Oh, and I need to mention past guest, 3 times past guest Rick Sterling writes for Mintpress News. He's had work published there, and the wonderful Whitney Webb. We did a special I did a special 3-part interview with her about the Epstein investigation. She used to be a staff writer for you at Mintpress News. So if people want to know where I get a lot of my information and some of my guests,
both very brilliant people. Yes,
exactly. We have to thank Ms.Adley for that. So Ms.Adley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Like I said, I'm excited to be with some, positive vibes today.
Likewise. It's a real honor to have you. So the first question I wanted to ask you, Ms.Adley, was you? You are from America, but your background is Palestine, and you did grow up very briefly in occupied Palestine. And so the first question I wanted to, and of course Palestine is in the news, and can you talk to us can you talk to us briefly about your experience growing up in occupied Palestine? Because when researching you, you had mentioned in an audience, that you had actually developed PTSD from your experience in occupied Palestine, but at the same time, it motivated you to want to become a journalist. So could you talk briefly what the terrible experience of growing up in occupied Palestine and how that led you to becoming to finding Mintpress News?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to shorten it up as best as I can in a short response to that. But although I was born and raised here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, right here in America, in the suburbs of Minnesota, my parents are originally both Palestinian. And so when I was around the 5th grade, about 9 years old, my parents decided to move us back to Palestine because their home, they wanted to make sure that we could not forget about our culture, our heritage, and our language, considering that their home country was under Israeli occupation and apartheid. And so we moved over there when I was around 9 years old, and it was very obvious that we had just moved into a police state. I mean, images that we see when riots erupt here in the streets, like the ones we saw on when George Floyd.
You grew up in East Jerusalem, or where?
Yes, in East Jerusalem. And, it was very obvious we had just moved into a police state. There were, military personnel, the IDF, roaming the streets with their rifle guns, pointing at civilians, very clearly fear-mongering. We'd regularly see military tanks driving through the streets, home demolitions by Israeli soldiers, and the police were just rampant in Palestinian cities. And so this was a very big culture shock coming from me, where we had just, grown up and lived in the suburbs of Minneapolis, where you wouldn't see police like that lined up in the streets. And so within the 2nd or 3rd year that we had lived there, the second Intifada had broken out. And now,
I was just about to ask what year, what year that was when you were a child in Palestine.
Yeah, so I think it was the year 2000 when the second Intifada had broken out, and things were somewhat, calm, despite the fact that it was occupation. But now with the second Intifada, the police presence in the streets, the military presence in the streets was ramped up. Checkpoints, armed checkpoints had increased. And now there was talk of Israel building the apartheid wall that was going through the West Bank, and basically to seize more land and separate Palestinian communities from each other. And so this was just another like traumatic shock to the system for myself as an American, but also to the people that were living there. And so this is where I really began to see major human rights abuses increase. I would witness crossing through checkpoints, children being shot at with rubber bullets. And a lot of people say, well, oh, they're just rubber bullets. Well, rubber bullets can kill these children. They can cause concussions. They can blind these kids. And a lot of times Israeli soldiers would shoot these rubber bullets right into the children's eyes and blind them on purpose. And they would also target journalists and nurses and doctors. It was a very regular scene. So I'm sitting there like crossing through these checkpoints in my taxi, my cab, or with my family in their car at the age of, now I was like 11. Now I'm about 11 years old. And this was like the reality that I was seeing around me. When we'd visit our family sometimes in the West Bank in Hebron, I remember we'd get stuck there sometimes for an entire week, maybe even 2, because now the city had gone under lockdown, military lockdown, where they wouldn't allow anybody to leave the city. And they put everybody under curfew where you could only leave the house for maybe a couple hours a day. And that's when people would like really race to go to the markets to get, fresh water or fruits and vegetables. And then they would have to like really go fast and get back home. And it was like, it was always chaos. And I just like the people there were just constantly living in fear. Our electricity was constantly cut off. And I remember I always talk about this when I give this, when I present this issues. I remember when I was about 12 years old sitting on a rooftop, and we would just sit there and we'd watch Israeli jets fire laser beams and drop bombs in homes in Ramallah. And then we'd be sitting there thinking as little kids, me and my brothers and sisters and like the neighbor kids, 12, 13 years old, we would be thinking like, I wonder if there was a family in there, are they okay? How's the mom? Did they survive that? And so that was like, it was constant trauma running through our brains living in Palestine. Yet the people always stood very strong. Palestinians always stood very strong. They were very positive. But as Americans, my parents had had enough, and they actually couldn't deal with it anymore. My dad was, having trouble working. And so we decided at that time, I was now almost 13, my parents had decided to move us back to Minnesota. And so when I had moved back to Minnesota, I was like in a culture shock once again, because I had just left like this war zone where everything was just like, everything was always chaotic. It was a matter of survival. Military presence. You're always thinking like, am I going to make it that day? Like I remember going to school with like half the kids not showing up to class because they were denied an education. They were basically not allowed to cross through checkpoints. And so when we had arrived back to Minnesota and like the very pristine suburbs of Minneapolis, it's just like everything was so still and so calm. Mm-hmm. And even though my surroundings were still in calm, my brain was racing so fast.
That's kind of how I felt. That's kind of how I felt when I visited my mom's country of the Congo for the first time. And you're just shocked by the poverty, the impoverishment, and the underdevelopedness. And then all of a sudden, like you're back in the Western world, the affluent Western world. It could be Belgium or London, and you're kind of like, literally you are feeling like WTF about it all.
Like, is this real life? Is this real life? I had to like question my sanity so much, even though it was a very young age. And just like you described, you're like, what is happening? Like, do people even know what's going on overseas? And no, they don't. These kids in these suburban American schools are so spoiled, and they just don't have any idea. People here, we in the West are spoiled. Whether, even the poorest people in America, they still have access to iPhones, they still have access to the internet. And people in these countries don't even have access to basic, like, humanitarian services or even like clean running water. And so I had developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and I had to actually go to therapy and counseling. I was meeting with my school counselor regularly, and I was, going to therapy with a professional licensed therapist to talk about these issues. But then within that same year, September 11th happened, and I was turning to the media to kind of keep up to date with like what was happening in Palestine, and I realized that the media was flipping the narrative. They weren't showing this, the students that were like me who were being denied an education. They weren't showing like the elderly man who was being denied like crossing through a checkpoint to get medical care at Hadassah Hospital. They weren't showing the families who had roots to this land for hundreds of years, but Israel was demolishing their home because they didn't have the proper permit. You know, the media didn't show these images. What they showed was like a lie. They flipped the narrative and presented the Palestine-Israel issue as an issue, as a conflict between like Muslim versus Jews, presented in a religious lens. One that showed that
so you say that's a lie, because I often hear from my Israeli friends, many of them who are big supporters of Netanyahu or whoever is the rival ultra Zionist of the of the day, and they say that, oh, it is a religious conflict, hence why we can never get to point. Yeah.
Well, it's presented to the mass people in the West as a religious conflict, to show people that, hey, it's just like these people have been fighting each other for thousands of years and they just can't get along because they hate each other. And so when we say it like that, and we don't present it in a way where it's like, no, we have an oppressor stealing land, stealing access to resources, oppressing people, denying education, people are more likely going to give up and not care about an issue when you say, oh, it's just like a religious fight. And so when it comes to Israelis as well, it's just like pandering to the right-wing religious fundamentalists here. The people that support Netanyahu are usually right-wing fundamentalist Israelis. And so the Israeli media and Netanyahu do pander to them through religious means. But at the end of the day, there's, whether it's Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, these religions are of peace. They're not promoting violence and theft of land. It's the politicians that are using religion as a means to control people and manipulate people. And so that's what Netanyahu is doing, and his right-wing Likud government. Netanyahu is just a bloodthirsty politician who, has a political agenda. He's by no means a religious person. He may act like it on the outside, and a lot of these people, like President, like President Bush, when he said, like, God came to me and Jesus told me I gotta go, invade Iraq. Like, really? That's what Jesus wants you to do? Go kill 2 million people, innocent people?
And giving taxes to the rich. About that.
And the same thing for like groups like ISIS, when they use religion, they say like Islam teaches us to like rape women. I'm like, what? No. They do these things just to pander to the very uneducated emotional aspect of people's minds. But these issues are rooted in human rights, imperialism, occupation, the military industrial complex. Israel and Palestine is just a proxy war that is just fueling the military industrial complex. It's so good for weapons manufacturers, and it's so good for conflict and tension in the region to continue to fuel like US militarism and hegemony in the region. And so we can't, forget about that. And so I realized that at 13 years old, I realized all of this, and I was like, whoa, the media is like flipping the narrative to justify this military war machine. And then 9/11 happened. I saw the media beating the drums of war once again to justify the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I saw how the media demonized Palestinians to justify these wars. They demonized and dehumanized billions of Muslims around the world. They basically like recreated this narrative about what Islam was and what the region was. It was like a caricature to show that the region was, barbaric, backwards, uncivilized. It was a dehumanization smear tactic to lump all of the people in the Middle East and the Muslim world into this, really negative caricature that is really rooted in like modern day colonialism. Like when they say colonialism died, no, we're living in an era of modern day colonialism. And so that's when I realized it really is the media that was allowing these things to happen. The kids in my class who are so worried about like partying and drugs and like who their next date is going to be, they didn't know because the media was manipulating people and basically lying about these issues. Don't mean to go on a rant, but that was my aha moment. And yes, I was very young. I was 13 years old. But at that moment, I decided I wanted to be a journalist. And I was going to be that person who's going to one day work within the media to change the face of media, to show the true reality of the destruction that the military machine leaves behind, and also show the real reality of what like a Muslim woman is, what an Arab is, what a Palestinian is, and show that we're all in this fight. It's all just a class war that's taking place around the world at the hands of the billionaire class, small percentage of people in this world that make up less than 1% of the population, that are waging this war, a class war against like the people of the world to exploit, to take our resources, to take our wealth. And so once people realize that, then they'll know that the enemies are not, you and I based on skin color or religion or ethnicity or race or sex, creed, whatever it is. It's really this 1% billionaire class that rule over us.
How do you? But you lived as it. Well, I mean, how do you? No, okay. When you were living in Palestine, you had an American passport. Did that save you and your family at all from these systemic
Absolutely.
human rights abuses? Even though,
Yeah. So as Americans living there, yes, we're Palestinian, but because we were American, we were able to cross through checkpoints, like I described, whereas Palestinians who were in the West Bank weren't allowed to cross the checkpoint to get to hospitals, to get access to medical resources, hospitals, their universities and schools. And the way that Israel has set up these checkpoints is that they are separating cities and towns and communities from each other. And so somebody's school might just be 5 minutes away, but because this checkpoint's right here in this very conveniently located spot, Israel's denying these children from going to school over here because of this checkpoint. And so we were able to cross through all the checkpoints and get through things. And, sometimes we'd use it to our advantage because, we'd say like, oh, we have an American passport. We want to get through this thing so that we can travel to get groceries or something. It's very sadistic because it's like the people there, the Palestinians there who are born and raised there are, denied, access through the country. And another thing, Youri, I wanted to mention is that both my parents, born and raised in Palestine, because they're now American citizens, Israel has now revoked any ties to the land of Jerusalem, even though they were both born and raised in Jerusalem. They only came to America, I think, when they were, for college, right? Now they're in their 50s. But so because of that, my parents now go to Palestine. They can only go there for 2 months at a time as tourists because of having an American passport. So having an American passport, yes.
So any Palestinian that is able to even leave Palestine to go study abroad and work abroad, that comes at a price because.
Yes. They'll revoke any sort of ties to the land. Now, Palestinians in Palestine, they're not considered citizens. According to the state of Israel, they're considered residents. So that residency can be revoked at any time.
Wow. But how do you manage to go back into into wanting to be a journalist and even having to and having to confront the realities and the horrors of Palestine when as you mentioned you were trying to overcome being shell shocked and post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, I think a lot of times people go through trauma and they can either go either of two ways. One is they can get stuck in their trauma and allow it to destroy them. They can allow that pain to take over them and they kind of get stuck in that sadness. And they don't have the courage. They don't know that they do have the courage to break through and heal and speak out against what caused them to have that trauma. And so what I did is I found the courage and I found the catharsis to use my trauma, to use my pain, to use my anger that I had and use it as my voice, to use it as my passion and my strength to speak up. And when I did that, I lost a lot of friends in high school, in junior high. A lot of kids thought I was too into politics or whatever it may be, too Miss Goody Good. I was an overachiever, always talking about how I'm going to change the world and go into journalism. All my speeches were about the same thing.
They probably didn't shun you for the trauma, but more like shunning you because they just thought that you were too nerdy and
yes. But then you have to realize that those people are not your true friends. Those are those are the you have to be your own leader. You have to be your own hero. And so I did that. I found that courage and strength and I used that to my advantage. And I always spoke about my trauma, always spoke about what was going on in Palestine. And it really drove me in the direction that I headed in, where I am today. I mean, that passion of mine, that strength that I found within myself led me to break barriers within US mainstream media. I worked within mainstream media organizations as a Muslim hijabi. I became the first American Muslim woman to wear the hijab to anchor and report the news in American media. Although I did end up leaving corporate media because I realized, sure, I broke that barrier, but I'm still reporting on the same crap that they're reporting. And so I left, and that's when I really decided that, if I'm gonna really change media and do what I want to do, then I'm gonna start my own. And that's when I started Mintpress. And at first, I just kind of did my own thing. It started out very slow, very small, and I was kind of just my own blogger, doing my own interviews. I'd show up at universities whenever like a big name would appear for like a panel discussion or an event, because universities are really good hotspots for stuff like that. And that's how I found my calling. And then from there, I started Mintpress, and then within a couple of years, I was able to get the proper, funding and support and people to join the cause. And that's when I built Mintpress into the news organization it is today. And right now, what we focus on is, when I first started Mintpress, I had to really think like, what's the focus here? What's the agenda here? And it has been the same. And it is to expose these special interests influencing policies at home and abroad. Who are these individuals and these special interest groups, these Washington think tanks, these lobbyists that are influencing our politicians to support war, to draft bills that promote the military-industrial complex, that work to hijack resistance movements here in the United States? And so that's when we really made waves within independent media to showcase these things. And that's why we have been successful. And it, of course, has not been possible without the support of our readers. But we're actually about to hit our 9-year anniversary this December, which I'm very proud of.
Oh, fantastic. And I'll have to get you back on for that. And that's a great segue into, another thing I want, one last thing I want to say about Palestine is, could you give us the latest update on the situation in Palestine? Because the ruling coalition government of Netanyahu, wants to fully annex the West Bank, and I just find it hilarious how I'm not I would, if I was a Palestinian, I wouldn't vote for Hamas, but I just find it hilarious how everyone keeps talking about how Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map, and therefore Israel can no longer have any negotiations with the Palestinians. Meanwhile, even though Gaza has this monstrous embargo, Israel is fully annexing the West Bank, which is ruled by Fatah. So it's Israel now that we see who actually is not interested in any sort of peace in Palestine, in the resolution. So could you give us an update on what's going on with the annexation of the West Bank, and does this mean that this is the end of Palestine unless people get into the streets and protest?
Well, yeah. So the biggest thing is we've been following is this deal of the century, which is being dubbed the steal of the century, because that's really what it is. When Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner basically led this whole deal under, it was being presented in a way where, look, we're trying to normalize relations with Israel in the Middle East and promote democracy and human rights and peace in the region. But actually, it was just another steal of Palestinian land, theft of more Palestinian land in the making. That's why one of the biggest things people have ignored or maybe underlooked in the deal of this, I keep calling it the steal of the century.
Steal of the century.
The deal of the century is that actually what it allows for is for Israel to annex basically all of the West Bank and put a blockade around it, just like it did with Gaza. And this is a really, really big deal because we now have another major human rights conflict in the making. Israel has already taken so much of Palestinian land. I think it's over 75% within the West Bank. And the land that they're going to be taking more within this deal of the century is all of the fertile agricultural land within the West Bank, all access to the Jordan Valley River where fresh water reserves are. And so it's always presented to us in a way that's about, peace or, religion or whatever it is. But if you actually look, if you just like break through all of those layers, at the end of the day, it's all about military expansionism, access to water and resources. The Middle East is facing one of the largest droughts in its history, in its modern history, and there's a major water war taking place in the Middle East. And so Israel is trying to gain access to as much water as it can, whether it's through Egypt or even through access through other countries, but it's doing that through Palestinian land as well. And that's part of the reason why it controls a lot of Gaza, is because of access to the Mediterranean. It wants to have full access and control to all of the water access, and then also to the oil and gas reserves off of the coast of Gaza. I mean, that's like one of the most underreported things that people never talk about, or news organizations never report on, but we do at Mintpress. We try to break through what these issues are really are about, and go behind the headline to connect them to the militarism. And so this is, I think, the deal of the century is really the biggest thing. The second thing is this normalization with Gulf states that the United States is spearheading. Mike Pompeo, Jared Kushner, they're trying to normalize relations between Israel and the Gulf countries. Now, Israel has been pretty good with these Gulf. Yes, they've been pretty friendly with the Gulf nations for a while, but it's kind of been underhanded in the background. But now it's more out in the open. And I this is related, but in Saudi Arabia, for example, I mentioned how religion is being used to control people and manipulate people. Some of the major Saudi what are they called? Mujtahids that basically release like fatwas, for example, on what you can and can't do. In recent years, leading up to this normalization with Israel, they were actually releasing fatwas for Palestinians to accept their occupier. And Palestinians obviously know that this is like some bullshit, right? They know that this is like Saudi Arabia putting their influence and putting their money into and using religion and extremism to push their agenda. But I knew that it was leading up to normalization with Israel, and that's what's taking place right now. And the reason why it hasn't happened sooner is because most people in the Middle East and the Muslim world are extremely outraged at the Israeli occupation of Palestine. But they're slowly working their way through to, through religion. And then we got to keep an eye on this. Through religion, since the Middle East is somewhat a conservative and religious place, people, they follow their faith. They're going to use religion as a means and media as a means, to manipulate people into supporting peace with Israel. And that's already happening in places like Lebanon. It's already happening. So it's going to be happening soon. And it's going to be completely disastrous for the region, because normalization with Israel does not mean peace. It just means more control over the region, because Israel wants control of the Middle East. It wants to have that influence, and it's just really a proxy of the United States.
Is it safe to call the Gulf monarchs a misleadership class, just like how Black Agenda Report decries the Black misleadership class and other indigenous peoples decry their misleadership class, that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are a kind of a misleadership class? Like they talk a whole lot of crap about we defend Palestinian rights and down with Zionism and Americanism, when really they're always doing these wheeling and dealing schemes.
Yeah, I mean, all of these leaders in the Middle East were not really elected by the people. They were, put up by the United States. And so that's why they don't truly represent the people of the Middle East. Like the Saudi monarchy, I mean, if we really want to talk about, religion, Islam actually forbids monarchies. It actually promotes democracy and people being able to elect their leaders. Well, guess what? The people in Saudi Arabia are ruled by a monarchy where there are no free elections. Like people don't get to elect their leaders there. It's like basically like a dictatorship. And these people are the result of British and American colonialism, having access to oil and gas from Saudi Arabia. The same thing with all of the Gulf countries. All of those leaders that make up the monarchies there whether it's the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain. These leaders are all, influenced heavily by the United States, and they don't really represent the people there. I mean, that's why Saudi Arabia has been suppressing years-long protests in their southern provinces. That's why they're in Yemen, destroying any sort of resistance there. That's why the UAE is working hand in hand with the United States to occupy half of Yemen, basically. And Bahrain suppressed a major uprising against the monarchy there that were demanding for, human rights and democracy. So, but that's why the United States is targeting countries like Syria and Iran and Hezbollah with sanctions, is because those countries speak out against Israeli occupation. They speak out against Western colonialism, and they promote, working class movements in the region, and to basically resist any sort of like Western capitalism in the region. So yeah, that's why those countries are targeted with sanctions. They just want them to comply, and they are refusing to do so.
Now, how much more time do we have? Because I think we're pressed for time, right?
Oh, just 5 more minutes.
Okay, then, all right, all right. I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna skip this question about Minnesota, but yeah. So then, okay, two very briefly, then, because you mentioned Syria. Why do you think there's not as much outrage over the Western Gulf War on Syria as there is on Yemen? Because your outlet has covered both and denounces both as imperial projects, but so much left-leaning outlets and NGOs have jumped the shark on Syria, but not just Syria, also the hunts for WikiLeaks and the anti-Russia hysteria of Venezuela and so forth. But just specifically on Syria.
Because it's it's multifaceted, but two main points is because the main one is because the war in Syria has been presented through a sectarian lens, that it's Sunni versus Shia. The Assad government represents like a Shia minority, and they are basically suppressing this organic uprising by the Sunni majority. And so from the very, very beginning, it was presented from a sectarian lens. And so that sectarian narrative was also fueling anti-Iran propaganda. A lot of people on the left, instead of, they view Iran as an equal level, Iran and Saudi Arabia as like these equal players in the Middle East. But in fact, Iran is not exporting terrorism and Wahhabism and militias to be fighting in different countries, whereas Saudi Arabia is 100% openly to exporting Wahhabism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, working with the United States to promote, terrorism and sectarianism and division within the Middle East. And so I think that's where a lot of people on the left get it wrong. They're being sucked into the State Department narrative that Iran is the enemy, when Iran is actually resisting Western imperialism and capitalism. And so that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect is this new Cold War narrative with Russia. Because Syria is an ally of Russia, a lot of people on the left who got sucked into the Cold War rhetoric that, Russia hacked into our elections and Russia is the enemy and they're the ones destroying our democracy.
Which, to quote John Pilger, is a bunch of bollocks. Just have to.
Yes. That's right. And so that's the second aspect, is that they're just falling for these, for this Cold War rhetoric, and not that Russia is some saint or Syria is some saint country. Like, we can go, these are not perfect nations. That's not the point. We're not saying that this country is good and this country is bad. I think the point of this is that, we should be just minding our own business here in the United States. I mean, we have so many issues right here to deal with. Why are we putting so much heart and energy into overthrowing these leaders overseas, like the Assad government? You don't like Assad, fine, but let's put our energy over here where we have massive unemployment, where billionaire class people like Jeff Bezos, Michael Bloomberg, Warren Buffett are accruing more wealth than the top 99% of this country, or the bottom 99% of this country. We have mass protests here, Black Lives Matter. We have protests against climate change. where are these people on these issues? You know, they're putting so much energy on like, look, we need to bring down the Assad government or this government or that government. Like all those conflicts do is play into U.S. hegemony.
And all it results is another Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and then you remind them, and then like I remind them about Iraq and Libya. Oh, this is different than Iraq and Libya. This is different. It's like, how is this different? Every single U.S. regime change war has resulted in the exact same issue: a failed state, sectarianism, bloodshed, genocide, whatever it may be. And who are the benefactors of these? It's the weapons manufacturers. It's the billionaire class. It's a special interest group. It's the lobbyists. It's the same group of people that continue to get richer and richer and richer because we're so busy like fighting each other and playing into that. And so we just have to remember what the end goal here is for them, and then we will maybe be able to find peace and unity within our movement.
Well, Ms.Adley, I wish we had more time, but I know that you mentioned that you have some motherly duties to do, some family duties. But this will be the first, I hope, of many conversations. In the event that you are too busy within the coming weeks or months, I'll definitely contact you again so that we can celebrate the 9th anniversary of Mintpress. So until then, we were joined by Ms. Mnar-Adley, the founder, editor-in-chief of Mintpress News. Folks, if you loved Whitney Webb's appearance, Rick Sterling's appearance, and you've become more informed on my position when it comes to Syria and so forth and other hot topics which the left has jumped the shark on, you can do no better than to check out Mintpress News. So, Ms. Adley, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to have you back on again very soon.
Thank you so much, Youri. I really appreciate it. It was very nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Ciao until then.